Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Books and Books, right here in the cultural heart of Coral Gables. We're very happy to have you with us. While you are silencing your cell phones, please take a look at our Books and Books newsletter. We have these on the counter, of course, tonight where the books are being sold. This will give you a synopsis of all the wonderful events we have here at Books and Books every night of the week. We have Spanish events, kids events. There's something for everyone usually going on here. So many of them are being live streamed through the internet, as you can see by the lights and cameras tonight. And also, I will tell you straight up that with these cameras facing the crowd, for the benefit of the people watching, please make sure you are sitting next to who you're supposed to be sitting next to. So I encourage you to take a copy of this or go online, give us your email address. We can send you all the information so you don't miss a thing. There's a couple worth mentioning. Lisa C. will be coming up next week with her book China Dolls. Neely Tucker and The Ways of the Dead, Joanna Rakoff, My Salinger Year, just to name a few. So take a copy of this with you. And while we love to have you here in the store, of course, you don't need to be now. You can watch online if you prefer, and you can call the store at the number on your screen to order a signed copy of the book while the event is in progress. We'll hold it for you, or we'll ship it to you anywhere in the U.S. with the shipping free of charge. But tonight we are very fortunate and very happy to have with us Marc Levy and his book Replay. Marc Levy's novels have sold over 30 million copies and have been translated into 40 languages, making him today's most widely read French author. His English language debut, If Only It Were True, sold almost 500,000 copies and was a film starring Reese Witherspoon and Mark Ruffalo. He lives in New York City. Our interviewer this evening is a good friend of the store, Patrick Alexander. He's an English-born writer who raised his children in France, Italy, Switzerland, Ireland, and California before settling in Coral Gables. He's worked on 4 continents as an international finance consultant, corporate executive, and a university teacher and administrator. His lifelong love of French literature resulted in the several classes he has taught on the writings of Marcel Proust, while his second book, Marcel Proust's Search for Lost Time, was published in New York in 2009. His first novel, The Nigerian Letter, was released in March of 2011, and currently Patrick is working on the Books and Books Guide to Wine Appreciation based on the widely popular and successful 6-week wine appreciation class he teaches right here at Books and Books. So please give them both a nice warm welcome, Patrick Alexander and Marc Levy.
Start off talking about is my daughter, my eldest daughter. She's just reached 40. She has 2 children. She lives in France, in Paris. She has a high-level executive position with Baccarat. She's she's Parisian. She's sophisticated. It takes a lot to impress her, certainly from an old father who lives in Miami. But last week I spoke to her on the phone, and I told her that you and I would be talking this evening, and she said, "Oh mon Dieu, oh mon Dieu." That's French for OMG, and insisted, and insisted, oh my God, insisted that I take a selfie. It's my other daughter to explain to me what a selfie was. So that's what I promised her to do, so let's see if we can do it. There we go.
Look,
Oh!
It's done.
I've been so nervous all week. Can I go now? It's
Sure.
It really did bring home to me just how enormously famous you are in France. It's like she explained it. Is this still working? She compared you to Mick Jagger, and so
Physically speaking,
she is English speaking. And so I'm very curious, how do you handle fame? I actually heard from her that sometime, even in Vietnam, where most Westerners we all look the same, you were recognized twice in the street. Is this true?
it is. It did happen. But I was with my wife, and I told her that it was probably candid camera. I was absolutely sure it was candid camera. And I live very far away from my country because I live in New York, and honestly, the only place where I'm really famous in New York is at the bakery, the fish market, where I go twice a week, and at the restaurant near my house where I go almost every day to have a cup of coffee. That's really the place where I'm famous in the United States. So
and Hanoi.
And so it's dealing with that kind of fame is not too harsh, believe me.
And in Paris, are you not recognized?
No, yes, I am. I am.
Hence-
but
hence the selfie.
I'm spending there about 2 weeks per year. So, and it's not like I'm not Mike Jagger. I've never seen, sadly, any girl running after me to get my shirt. It's, I mean, something I've wished for all my youth. Now it's a little bit too late. Well, Mike Jagger might prove the contrary, but still, and you know, in the writer's world, it's much more quiet. Eventually, people ask you to sign their books, but they rarely. So dealing with the fame for a writer is not something very difficult at all.
One of the reasons I was asking the question straight away, I did want to hear you speak, because having read some of your books, and even though on the cover it explains that you're one of the most well-read authors in France, I would not have known that you were French from your books. A lot of them are set in San Francisco, New York, London, Buenos Aires, Africa, Istanbul, but there's no sense of Frenchness. Why is that? Or is that true? Am I being unfair?
No, it's quite true. Why? Because I've spent most of my life traveling all over the world and trying to meet different culture than mine, and trying to keep an open mind to the world. And because I was raised by parents who luckily taught us that the center of the world was not the center of our own, was not our belly, but that so I was raised with this appetite of, being excited by the culture of others and by traveling and discovering. So what I put in my book is what I see and not what I am.
But even so, I'm curious, just because there's no emphasis on French, or the French culture, or the French way of thinking things, and yet you're so popular in France and just becoming better known here in America. Is it the language? Do you write in French?
Yes, I do. I write, I dream, I live. Have you seen my accent? If my dream were in English, there would be nightmares. So hopefully I dream in French. And no, I'm after 15 years spent in English, I lived 10 years in London, 6 years in New York, 6 years in San Francisco, and I still carry on this accent. And every time I meet an American, they say, "Oh, you have a lovely French accent." They think they are going to please me, and it's just killing me. Even my youngest, I have a young son who is 4 years old, and he's an American citizen. And now he enters in the age where he corrects me, which is so frustrating when I read him bedtime story. So what was your question? Sorry.
Well, there's really the difference between you as a French writer and in English. And if I may quote you, this is in France Today a couple of years ago, you said, "Being immersed in English has definitely affected my way of thinking and structuring the novels. The language, English, is more efficient, more radical, and more direct than French, and it helps me get to the point." Is that, yet you're still writing in French?
Yes, but the way I see literary, I see it as a land of freedom with no border. And I've always, in fact, when I read a book, I really don't care what the nationality of the writer is, except if it's really relevant to the story. If it's an historical book, or if the writer is telling about his personal story. I think there is something magical with literary, which is that some books can cross the borders of language, and that the story, the characters are made in such a way that you can, even when they are translated, they are still talking in your own language. Maybe I can give you one example of where it was probably the most complicated way, and as you were talking about Vietnam, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I wrote a book called Children of Freedom, which is a book about a group of teenagers during World War II who created a group of resistance, which was one of the most active group of resistance during the war, and one of the youngest. And it was It was a very special group, first of all, because they were all teenagers. I mean, between 16 and 25. Second, because most of them die saying "Vive la France," but with a foreign accent, because they were all foreigners. Most of them were foreigners, coming from Spain, Italy, Poland, Romania, etc., etc. And so I wrote this book. And surprisingly, I was invited to Vietnam, and I was doing a conference at the University of Hanoi. And just before the conference, there is this woman. She's in her late 70s, and she comes to me and she says, "I'm going to be your translator tonight, and I'm also the woman who translated your book in Vietnamese." So I was very touched to meet my translator, and I say, "Thank you so much." And before the conference started, she said, "You know, it was really special for me to read this book and to translate this book, because me too, I was in the resistance." And I say, "Oh, how come? You were in the resistance?" "Yeah," and she said, "And I was in the resistance at the same age than your main character. I was 18. But the enemy was the French." And she said to me, "Like the character in the book, I was tortured too. But the one that was torturing me was the French." And I was, of course, very moved by this encounter with this woman. But what was the whole purpose of writing was that finally she told me that while she was translating the book, she became the main character of the book. She was Jeannot, and do you imagine the bridge of this woman, which has been arrested and tortured by the French, and suddenly step in the shoes of a French young resistance during World War II? So, sorry for this long answer, but for me, literary has no border. When I was young, I was lucky, and because I was not good at school. And so I was not reading what I was told to read at school, and I was so excited by the idea of reading that very soon I started to read foreign books. And I learned so much from those books about the way of telling story and about the different way that story were told, either, you know, in Southern America or in Northern America or even in India. And there is so many ways of telling story that maybe a part of these readings have finally get into my blood. So
There was one final thing about that main character, Jeannot, in the book that the Vietnamese lady translated. Did you want to tell the audience? Who was that character based on?
It's my father, my own father. And it was a very special book. It's the only book where, which was really related to, where the character were not fictional. But yes, the character of Jeannot is the. But there were all the characters in this book are real, have existed, and the whole story. I just related the story. I didn't do much more than relating their real story. So that's, yeah. So definitely, I think that literary has no border.
But I'm still interested in the whole the idea between the difference in French language and English language, which you presumably, living in New York, speak every day.
Mostly the kitchen.
Are there different ways of thinking?
I mean, mostly the food that the writer eats, which might influence definitely in the process of writing. No, more seriously, we live in the 21st century, and information travels faster than we can do, and information now comes from all over the world, and books are more translated than they have ever been. So almost, literary and cinema from all over the world is accessible to the most of us, especially with the internet.
And selfies.
And selfies too. I don't know if there is such many differences. There were, at the time, a very big difference between the French literary of the 70s and the American literary of the 70s. We had in France during about 30 years a kind of a reign of what was called the Nouveau Roman, which was a type of literature very. I have no idea how to say this word in English. Introverti. Thank you so much. And very self-centered and very much about writing about just emotions and even writing books without stories, while the American at this time were writing a lot of story named character-driven story. I'm definitely a character-driven story writer, which doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do that if you're French, or you can't do that if you're Spanish. I think you can do whatever you want when you are a writer, because the amazing thing about being a writer is that you step in a land of absolute freedom with no constraint, except one, which is the best definition has been made by a French writer who said about literaries, this story is true because I invented it from the beginning to the end. Which is, that's it.
So therefore, as you know, I'm addicted to Proust. So
Yes.
So I was curious about the difference between, say, Joyce, because in fact next Monday I think is Bloomsday. Is it next Monday?
Yes.
And when we celebrate James Joyce, and I of course think that Proust's novel is the greatest novel of the 20th century. Not that, even though I'm Irish, not Joyce's. Do you think?
But it's funny because I don't think that such things. I don't think that such things exist. I think that the particularity of a book, there is something really different between a book, a movie, or even a painting. A painting in a museum can be seen by 50 people at the same time. A movie will be seen in a theater by 300 or 400 people at the same time. But a book is only read by one person at a time. And there is something we all do with a book that we don't do in a theater, and we don't do in a concert, or we don't even do in a museum, is that if you read a book, and even if someone very close to you come, and step over your shoulder and start to read, after a few seconds, you're going to say, you know what, I'll finish the book and I'll give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And we all do that.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a reason, I believe, why we do that, is that the relationship between a book and a reader is something very personal and very intimate. And there is a kind of a love affair between a book and a reader. And what is the greatest book for me might not be the greatest book for you, and it doesn't mean at all that my book is better than my greatest book is better than your greatest book. I think that the story between a reader and a book, it's exactly like a love story. I'm sure that your wife is the most extraordinary wife of the world.
Oh, beyond.
And the fact is that mine too.
Brilliant.
And we are definitely not going to try to compete on that.
Absolutely.
And I've never understood, why in books, especially in books, I hear so many times very passionate discussion about who wrote the best book. Every year in France we have this French magazine which try to print the list of the best book of the 20th century. It doesn't care. I mean, it doesn't matter. The best book for each of us is the book that has touched us at a moment of our life and became, for a reason that belongs only to us, our best friend for the time of a reading that we keep in our memory. Don't you think?
Yes, no, I absolutely agree.
Okay. And it's probably because of this that despite what a lot of people in the literary world say, there is still so many books in bookstores. Because otherwise, the only book in bookstores would be the 20 best book of the 20th century. But look around you, just in this, very big library, how many books there is. And I can tell you, when I was, in my 30s, and one night I just had been dumped. Do you say dumped by a woman? Yeah. That you say that, huh? Okay. Well, and it was like, if the sky fell on my feet, and I was in a bedroom staying at some friends, and on the nightstand was a book from a writer named Romain Gary, and the book was Claire de Femme, and I swear it's true. This very night, when I went to bed after dinner at something like 11 p.m., I could swear to all the gods of the world that I will never love again, and I will never date any woman again, and that it was not worth it. And I read that book, and at 2 a.m. I finished it, and I started to read it again. And I read it 3 times in the night, and at 7 a.m., absolutely exhausted, there was only one thing I wanted to do, which was to fall in love again. And that's the magic of book. And that book became one of the books that I will ever keep. And every time I had in my life a friend, when you see one of your best friend arriving with the face, and you say, "Oh my God," and and you say, "My wife left me," I buy the book and I say, "Read this." So,
I must say, your remark about being surrounded, bookshops wouldn't exist if there was, unfortunately, that's what's so wonderful about books and books, I might say, is that increasingly we do find bookshops where there are only
absolutely
20 best books, 20 top sellers rather. So that's why it's great being here in Books and Books.
Definitely.
One last thing on the whole subject of the difference between French and English or Anglo culture, music.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a great admirer of French literature, French painting, French architecture, but when it comes to music, I grew up a bit older than you, but we grew up with Johnny Hallyday. And that was all you got in France. So Elvis would produce his music, and 2 years later Johnny Hallyday would produce a version. And the Beatles came, and forgive me because, and the reason I'm raising this is, you're one of Johnny's songwriters. So
I think it's John Lennon who said French rock and roll is like French rock and roll is like English cooking. So, who is your favorite cook in England?
He's a Frenchman.
But yes, in this desert we still have Johnny Hallyday, who is an amazing singer. And have you ever?
I saw his movie Man on a Train, which I just thought was fabulous.
But the singer is an amazing singer, and still, I won't say his age, but believe me, I was recently invited to one of his concerts, and it's just unbelievable. He's pure. You can't describe it. He's really a star. But I do agree with you. Apart him, the land of rock and roll in France has nothing to be compared with the land of English rock and roll.
Cooking is fabulous.
Yes.
No,
we have some great artists, but we can't fight with the English, definitely.
Tell us about your first book, it's Cité. How did you become a writer? Because in fact you had a very busy career long before you became a writer, and how did that happen?
Very accidentally, I have to say. I had no idea that I was writing a book, which is maybe why I did it. As I said, I was a young father, and I was a single father. And like a lot of father, I was telling a bedtime story to my son when he was 5 years old. And I had the very, very bad idea to start an ongoing story, with daily episode, which meant that every night my son was reproaching me that, the rabbit has already did that, and that, the story was not starting exactly where I left it the day before. And so I took the decision as soon as he was asleep. I was running into my study and I was writing the next episode. So memory fresh, and the story would match. And when it turned out to be 9, one evening he clearly made me understood that the TV was much more exciting than Daddy's story. So that was it, end of the story. And I was really missing that moment where I was writing, you know, for him. So came another idea, which was that if I couldn't write anymore for the child he was, I could maybe write for the adult he would become one day. And my idea was absolutely not to publish the book. I swear I had no idea I was publishing a book. My idea was that I was 38 at that time, and my idea was to give him the manuscript when he would be 38 too. I just wanted to trick the time. I wanted that for the time of a reading, my son and I would have the same age and could be the best friend of the world. And that was it. You know, it was really this idea of tricking the time and having, for the time of a reading, the age of my son. And accidentally, my sister found the book, I mean the manuscript, and she read it overnight, and then she became obsessed with the idea that I had to send it to a publisher, and she was calling me every day. And she was not even saying hello anymore, you know, or how do you do? She was saying, have you sent it? And I can still hear this, you know, picking up the phone and hearing, have you sent it? And so one evening I couldn't hold anymore this call, and I say, okay, pick one publisher, I'll send it, and we don't talk anymore about that. And so I sent the manuscript, and I was so lucky that 9 days later, the publisher called me and said, we want to publish your book. And in fact, I thought it was one of my best friend, and I almost hung up. But it was really a publisher, and that's how it became a book. So you see, all accident.
And then after it became a book?
And it became a movie.
Became a movie with Reese Witherspoon.
With Reese Witherspoon and Marc Ruffalo.
Which was...
called Just Like Heaven.
How many people have seen it? Great. Well, you actually helped me out here because I was wondering, there's some themes that run through all your books, I think, and you just really mentioned it. You wanted to trick time, the whole idea of writing it when you're 38 so that your son reads it when he's 38. And this is something that, well, for a start, your Frenchness comes out in your books in that they're very romantic. Every single one of your books has a man and a woman, and it's star-crossed lovers, very...
The last one, it's only 2 women.
Ah, well,
they are not dating.
We're moving into a new era here, but there's this idea of not only the 2 people, the man and the woman, but 2 lives. For instance, the Reese Witherspoon movie involved, she was apparently dead or in a deep coma, and he was the only person who could see her. So again, parallel lives there. This book, as I think any of you who've seen the cover know, that it starts off with a man who's killed. He's murdered, and then he's given 60 days, is it, something like that, back in the past, where he can discover why he was killed and who did it, and hopefully stop them from doing it. So again, it's death and life, these parallel, and in fact, I find this in a lot of your books. And then you hint at it a lot, where you talk about déjà vu. And now that I'm familiar with your work, the moment I see a bit of déjà vu, I think, oh, I know what's, you know, they've met in previous lives. Is that a fair... It's obviously an obsession with you. I mean, in the nicest way.
No, I can tell you why, in fact. The story of If Only It Were True, the apparent story was the story of this woman who is involved in a car accident, and she's in a coma in a hospital, and her soul gets out of the body, and so she gets back home, and her apartment has been rented to another guy, of course, and the other guy finds her in the closet where she hides, and the magic starts here because he's the only man who can see her. But in fact, the book has never been about the coma or even about this so-called fantastic appearance. The story of the book came to me because I was having a dinner with my best girlfriend, and she was single at that time, and she was 35, and she was very affected by being single. She was single for a long time, and she's an extraordinary woman. And we were having together a dinner in a restaurant, and suddenly she said to me in the middle of the dinner, you know, I think I'm invisible. So I said, what do you mean? Because I really can see you. And she said, no, listen to me. I'm taking the metro every morning. Nobody sees me. I'm working in a big company where I spend my whole days on a big, open space. Nobody sees me. I'm taking back the metro the evening. Nobody sees me. I'm living in a building with 100 neighbors who I never see, and they never see me. And the weekend, because I'm single, I'm working and nobody sees me. So believe me, I'm invisible. And when I left her and I came back from this dinner, I realized that the word invisible was the absolute perfect definition of loneliness. It was the absolute, it was the most profound definition of loneliness that I've ever heard. This feeling of being invisible. And I created this character of Lauren, who in fact is invisible. I found a situation to physically made her invisible, and she's invisible until one man see her. And one man see her for who she is and not for what she looks like. And I have a funny anecdote about this book, is that in this book, like in all my 15 books, I've never physically described one of my characters. Never ever. Because I think it's a magic of book to give this freedom to readers. And I was doing an interview with a French journalist on TV when this book was published, and during the interview the journalist said, so Laurence, this beautiful blonde girl, and I say, why do you say she's blonde? and he said, because you wrote it. And I say, no, I didn't. And during the whole interview he was, turning the page of the book, trying and after 10 minutes he was lost even in his question, and I said, believe me, I wrote the book. I really know that I never said that she was blonde. And he insisted, and he said, yes, you said. And I said, no. And it happened again last week. I was in a book reading, and the journalist about the last book that I have published in France started to give me a physical description of one of my characters, and once again I said, no, I didn't. So to get back on your question, all those subjects for me are the subject of second chance, for example, which I've worked on a lot in my books. In fact, it's a trick to talk about a second look and not about the second chance. If you take the story of Andrew Stillman in this book, yes, he's killed at the beginning of the book, and he wakes up. And when he wakes up, he's 2 blocks away from where he has been killed and 60 days before. And he has 60 days to try to do 3 things at a time, which he knows already he won't be able to do the 3 at the same time. 1, try to understand why he ruined his wedding and eventually save his wedding. The second, try to accomplish the most important investigation of his life of journalist. And 3, eventually try to understand who killed him and why, and eventually stop him before he does it again. And he knows that during these 60 days he won't have the time necessary to do the 3 things. So which one is he going to pick? And how is he going to manage the 3 things at the same time? But the whole story, in fact, is not about second chance. It's about the second look that he will have on things that he has already lived. And the difficulty of the book was because there is nothing worse than repeating yourself. So the difficulty in the book was that in the book the book starts with the 60 days before he's killed, and then you start again 60 days before. And then of course the idea was not to copy the first 60 pages and paste them, and so which would have made me very happy, because in one day I would say, yes, the book is done. The whole thing is that to take the same event, but because they are seen a different way, they are not at all the same event. and they don't look the same, and the story is not the same even, because just because the main character has accepted, because he has no other choice, to look at his own life and of course at life around him a little bit differently. And yes, the subject of second life, of second chance, has always fascinated me, because I think that it comes almost every day. It's if you change the word chance by second look, then you get the second chance in a lot of occasion. So that's something that comes in a lot of my book, and also because there is nothing more exciting than when you are a character story driven writer, to put your character in a situation where you can show what makes them real human. You know, what is their part of humanity.
I remember in Will You Be There? There's a chant. There's his name is Elliot, and he goes back, doesn't he, to a lot of. In this one, it's not only the main plot, the coma, but the girl.
In the
Valerie.
sequel of If Only, yes, he.
No. In this particular one,
Yeah.
also, she was an ex-girlfriend and had a relationship and it hadn't
Oh, yeah,
worked
yeah,
out.
definitely.
So this is again a second chance
Yeah.
in the main part of the book.
Absolutely, yeah. The woman that he's in love with and that he ruined the wedding with was in fact he met her when they were very young. They grew up both in the New York suburb called Poughkeepsie, and then they lost each other for 20 years, and they met again in New York 20 years later, and so it was already a second chance.
Did you live ever in Poughkeepsie?
In Poughkeepsie?
Yes,
No.
because as a Frenchman, you must find it I find it very difficult to pronounce. So is that part of the
Do you
puzzle?
remember this TV series which I was so fond of called Ally McBeal? And you remember the character who was a lawyer and he had a difficulty to speak. He was, comment on dit bégayer en anglais?
Stutterer.
Yes, stuttered. And every time that he was nervous, he had one word to stop stuttering, which was to say Poughkeepsie. And sometimes even in the middle of a big court hearing, he was speaking and he was starting to and Poughkeepsie, and everybody was looking, why does he say Poughkeepsie? And so, you see, one day I said, what is Poughkeepsie? And I started to look at what was Poughkeepsie. I discovered it was a city, and I put it in one of my books.
Have you been there?
Of course. It's an hour drive from New York. I had to write the book.
And you obviously spent a lot of time in San Francisco. I get the impression you fell in love with San Francisco.
I lived
because
there
of
for 6 years when I was 25, yesterday. I don't see why you find that funny.
And going back to your first book, I haven't been able to get a copy, but If Only It Were True, Part 2, where...
It was not published in the States.
Ah, that's why.
Yeah.
And it's almost a mirror version of... Because this time he's in a coma and she kidnaps him and takes him off.
Absolutely.
So
It's a resolution of the story.
a happy resolution this time.
Somehow.
Is it going to come out in the States?
I hope, maybe one day. I hope. Well, yeah. I don't know. That's a question to ask to my publisher. I know it's available in ebook, but will it be print or not? The path of publication is very complicated and very tricky.
I know. I think anybody here who's been involved in getting writing and getting published, your story about being bullied into contacting a publisher and then calling you back in 9 days and saying, "All right, we'll publish it," is a dream for everybody. So
I know.
you're living the fantasy.
I know that, and it has made me a lot of enemies. I don't tell this story usually. No, but I know I really am aware how lucky I was and how lucky I've been in my career of writers, and that's why I work very hard to try to deserve as much as I can of that luck.
Well, I think you're doing a great job. This I thoroughly enjoyed. It also had a serious theme to it. The child slavery, child trafficking. You bring up, first of all, was it Vietnam, I think was the
No,
first.
it's China.
It was in China. And then, of
But
course, in
yeah.
Argentina.
It's not. It's not. In fact, child slavery. The journalist has ruled, because the book has three topics: the topic of second look or second chance, and another very important topic of the book is identity. Where do we build our from where do we build our identity? And the very beginning of this conversation was so relevant, in fact, to what I wanted to talk about in the book, which is, am I being seen as a French writer because of my terrible accent? And when you read the book in American, can you get rid of this identity of French writer and see just the story? So, of course, when I speak to an American, the first thing an American will think is that he's French. But is this my identity? And I've always been fascinated by, how do we build our identity? Do we build it from our parents? Do we build it from our cultural heritage? Do we build it from the country we live? Do we build it from the events of life? Does our identity evaluate and change? Can it change completely over life? I've always been fascinated by those questions, and especially when I was writing the book about the war, I was wondering what can make a man becoming at one time not only a murderer, but someone who can torture other people. Where does it come from? Some of the characters I worked on were people who were torturing people during the day and coming back home at night, kissing their children in their bedroom and kissing their wife like if they were coming from the office. And you're wondering, how does that happen? What is the identity of this person? The one who torture, or the man that comes back home at what time of life the identity can be completely triggered and changed. And the main character does, first of all, an investigation which is in fact based on truth, where he discovered that 5,000 kids has been abducted from their real parent in China 10 years ago. They were taken by force by some corrupted police and military guys. Most of those children were 2 or 3 years old. And then they were sent to orphanage, where a false identity were created, and then they were perfectly legally adopted by American family. So there is about 5,000 of those kids who have grown up today and who lived in the United States. And the true story of those kids has been published in the States. So there is 5,000 parents in the United States. They don't know. And I was very, very surprised by some of them accepted to answer. What do you do? I mean, the situation is absolutely, it's the sophist's choice. Imagine that you have raised for 5 years a child who has become your child, and you know that this child has been stolen to his real parents. What do you do? I don't have the answer. I mean, do you bring back the child to the real parents, knowing that those parents live in hell? Because everybody here who has a child can understand, how you can feel if your child has disappeared. Do you bring the child back to your parents, or do you keep it? And when the child will be 18, if he discovers the truth, how are you going to handle that? So the main character has worked on this investigation, and then he's sent to Argentina to work on the stories of the children who were stolen during the dictatorship, and the particularity of those children was that most of them, their parents were killed, and their adoptive parents were the murderer of their real parents. And this is based on true story too, which means that some of those kids, when they reached 20 or 22 and discovered the truth, not only realized that their real parents has been assassinated, but that the parents they loved and cared and that raised them were, if not the murderer, in relationship with the regime that killed their true parents. How do you rebuild your identity once something like that happened? So the whole story of the book is about this, and I think the two subjects are very intimate and very, very related, which is how do you define your identity and how your identity can evolve with you if you accept to have the humility of a second look at things, which is to have some perspective towards things. That's the main story of the book.
Yeah, it's the most heart-wrenching part of the
Yeah.
book, actually, because you, as you just said, you don't have an answer. So you offer both. You have the husband and the wife with the Chinese
Yeah.
child. You have the two sisters from Argentina. And
Absolutely.
the decisions they have to make are really heartbreaking.
Because I think that what is important is not to pretend that you. What I like in writing, I would never pretend that I have any answer. But what I love in writing is to create the desire of sharing a question, which I think is already, such a wonderful thing to do, to share questions, than trying to say I have the answers. Except for the weatherman, he can do that. They are always wrong, and we still continue to listen to them every night.
It's a wonderful job.
Yes.
But in fact, you say you don't have all the answers. I now have all the answers. You've answered all the questions that I had. So maybe...
Thank you very much. Is there anyone that wants to ask a question? Yes, sir?
Hi, my name is Paul. My wife is Dominique. She's French. She's
Hello.
a teacher in a local high school. And my question is this. You wrote about the resistance. And that's a really interesting period in the history of France to me. And when I've been to France, I love to go to Les Invalides and visit the tomb of Jean Moulin. And it's a great history. But my question is this. How do you think France came to that point with the rich history that they had, their bold history with revolutions, and the French Revolution, a defining thing in our history, and the Commune, and all these things? How did they come to that point?
It's a very interesting question, and in fact, there is a strong relation between your question, the book I wrote, Children of Freedom, and this book. And the question is how much we think that the democracy and freedom are granted, and how much at one time what we have becomes more important than what we don't have. What I mean is that the answer to your question is there is only one word. The word is courage. It's courage to have this second look, to see the truth as it is. When I was working on that story, I went to Argentina and I asked to a lot of Argentinian people who witnessed this period of their history, in one sentence was coming all the time. And it really triggered the idea of writing that book. They were all saying, we would have never thought that something like that could happen to us. Never, ever. The reason why I wanted to write this story was because when we talk about dictatorship, most of the time we talk about country very far, far away, country we have never visited, culture that we feel, far from. So the young generation, even my generation, always had this, almost educational belief that, it could never happen to us. But in fact it does. And it can happen very rapidly. And the formula is always the same and works every time that the democracy failed. I just wrote a book which has been published a month ago in France, with about when I say a book with two women, with a book settled in the United States, and one of the women is 55 years old and the other one is 30 years old. And one has escaped from a prison in America where she has been condemned for 35 years, and she only has 3 more years to do, but she escaped. And she gets into the car of the other one, who is 30 years old, and she tells her, drive me to the West Coast. And they are in Philadelphia. And the reason why Agatha was in jail was that because in the 70s, she was a member of the Weather Underground. And she was an activist. But look at what happened even in United States in the 70s. And it's very, very fascinating because the Students for a Democratic Society was made of 100,000 of young people who wanted, who fought for a very noble cause. The end of the Vietnam War, the end of the apartheid, and the equal rights for women and men. At a certain time, when they became, when their movement became too much of an importance, the reaction of the government was an extraordinary violence towards them. And of course, it triggered that some of them started to become radical. And because this movement of radicals started to react to violence by violence, they discredited the movement in its globality, which is the formula that you can see happening in most countries, which at one time, falls from democracy to autocracy. That's what happened in Argentina. So that's what happened in France. At one time, a part of the French population has preferred order than fight. And so far, and that's a big topic in the story, in the book Children of Freedom, which is, in fact, there is a bigger part about the relationship between, the fight between resistance and French militia than between the resistance and the German. The French militia was even more active in some places than were the German. They wanted order. Some people prefer clean street and safety than freedom. So democracy is never granted. And when I'm lucky enough to go in a lot of schools, and I was doing a lot of schools when I was talking about Children of Freedom, and I always try to say to the young generation, don't think that your freedom or a democracy is something granted. I mean, freedom and democracy is like, it's something alive. It's like a child. It's something we need to be taken care of every day. It's something which can be healed, which can be attacked by the virus of corruption, which can attacked by so many viruses and can die, and it has died in a lot of countries. So I hope I answered your question.
You did,
Thank you. Oh, yep. I will do shorter answer. Sorry. Yes, sir.
Was that resistance different in Vichy versus the German-occupied France in the first couple of years of the war? Was the resistance that you talk about and write about mainly in German-occupied France, or was it in Vichy France as well?
It was in fact, it was settled in Toulouse and Grenoble. So they were fighting, but it was a very strategic place of the country because you had a canal called the Canal du Midi, and which is an artificial river that goes from almost from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and there is a lot of and this canal was used by the German to carry on a lot of military equipment to the Atlantic. So they were bombing trains, they were bombing cranes, they were bombing comment on dit des barrages, dams. And they were attacking the German, but they were fighting a lot initially with the French militia. Yeah, a lot.
My question has to do more with Miami. It's been a city where we function usually 2 or 3 languages, and I'm not surprised because I don't feel in your novels that you were French. I mean, I started reading your novels, and then I was happily surprised that you were French. I was surprised because you say that you still think and dream and write in French after living in the U.S. for a long time. So how do you do it? How do you have separate compartments that keep your English away from your French? And
I think it's the accent. I think that every time I start to dream in English, my accent wakes me. So Except to tell you the truth, I remember having a few dreams in English, and my accent was so great. In my dreams, I have, you know, a kind of a Peter Seller accent. It's wonderful. Yes, sir.
So, since you say you're writing in French, Mr.
Yes.
And so, are you involved with your translation into English? And if you read the English translation, are you able to say, yeah, that's not quite right, or how much is lost from the French reading?
The first translation of If Only It Were True was absolutely terrible. I mean, really, really terrible. And because the publisher was really, well, it's a long story, but that has been a nightmare. And then the book has been retranslated with a very nice translation. When I was working on that, so the first time I worked, you know, I said I have to trust. And then this terrible translation came out. It was a disaster. They even, you know, changed the chapter from one, you know, changed the order of the chapter. They cut they cut a lot of scenes where they saw that, you know, some American woman wouldn't stand that. For example, in the French book, at the very beginning of the story, when Lauren comes back from the hospital where she works, she undressed in her living room, and so they cut that because they say that an American woman would never undress in her living room. And I, you know, and we said, seriously, I can present you some, but still so. But finally, the publisher heard back so much that their translation was terrible that they accepted to do a new translation. And in fact, the new book has been published under the title Just Like Heaven, which was the title of the novel. But this being said, when we were working on the translation of Just Like Heaven, because I was doing that job, so I had the French book and I had the English book, and I was reading, you know, one line here, one line there, and saying, this word is missing here. And then the mailman rang. I was living in London at that time, and he brought me a package. And I opened the package, and it was a proof of the Chinese edition. And then I say, what hell? What can I do? So I went back to trust again. But no, more seriously, sometimes you read the sentence in English and you say, oh, that's so lovely. That's such a lovely way to say the things. I wish we would have that word or that expression. And sometimes you have the exact opposite feeling. You say, oh, it's so much beautiful in French. But there is a thing that you can't translate just so. But a good translator is a translator who will produce your voice. And I think that's the most important, even more important than, you know, a very specific word. It's just the fact that the translator understands the way you write and reproduce this music that you do. You know, when you write, there is the words, there is the meaning of the words, and there is around them this, you know, little music that makes a Proust sentence or a Hugo sentence. And what is important is that you hear this music. That's the most important quality. So in English, I'm so happy with this book because at least when I read, I don't have an accent in English. And so I found that voice. For the Chinese edition, I don't know. Yes?
Your books are novels, except Les Enfants de la Liberté. And have you ever been tempted to write other types of books, like biographies or
No.
play? Or
No. I never wanted to put myself. I was talking about the relationship between writing and freedom, and for me, as I said previously, writing is the absolute freedom, because if you do it humbly, if you look at what you write and you forbid you to look at you writing, which is very important. If you have this desire of learning with each book you write, learning your work, you know, and with no, I mean, without any shy of saying it, because I think that, you know, it's how every artisan work, you know, even a bread maker, I mean, you learn how to make bread while you make the bread, and I truly believe that you learn how to write while you write, except for the Mozart. There is a few Mozart, but I mean, they can't forbid everyone to sing, you know, under your shower. So, but it's such a freedom that I never wanted to put myself into a genre. So I've so far written, my first book was a romantic comedy. This one is a thriller. I wrote an historical book. I wrote 2 thrillers. The last book that I wrote is a road book, truly, literally speaking. But I like to play with fictional character, even if their story is often true and often inspired from true story. For example, this one, everything that the character says or have lived in Argentina is true, and it's based on investigation I made, on people I met, and it's true destiny. But the main character is a fictional one, because it gives me more freedom. Because I remember when I was writing Children's of Freedom, how much I was afraid of, you know, being them. You know what I'm trying to say is that when I was writing the story about these true young people, I had not only to tell them story, but tell their story, but I also had to relate who they were, how they saw it, and what were their motivation, and so it's a really different work.
Folks, we have time for one more question.
Yes, madam.
I'm curious as to why you changed publishers and what you think of Europa Editions now publishing you. Will that change the scope of your work or the reach, or what was...
Well, in fact, I'm going to be very honest. I changed publisher because after the after the story of the translation of If Only It Were True, the relationship with the first publisher was not at its, you know, top notch. And then, because it was a very big publisher, I was quite banned for a certain time. You know, there is this kind. And then, luckily, one day I met Michael Reynolds from Europa, and it's a wonderful publishing house, and he's a wonderful man. And I mean, truly, we are in a period of literary where some publisher, you know, are publishing products, and some publisher publish you because they like your book. When I'm saying product, a great book can be seen by a publisher like a product, if you see what I mean. Saying, you know, this is going to fit to such type of reader, and there is one thing which I'm so grateful to Michael, because I think that these days it's so unbelievable to hear that from a publisher, is that the first time, so he took the English translation, he read it, and he came back and he said to me, I love your book because I'm absolutely unable to define what genre it belongs to. And generally, this sentence from a publisher means we can't publish you. You know, we absolutely cannot publish you. So, and for him, it was, you know, and we have done like 3 conferences like this together, and every time he say, I love this book, you cannot put him in a genre. And so, so I hope I will continue a long time with my publisher. In France, I'm with the same publisher since 15 years. As in Spain, as in most countries, in fact, I'm very fidel. You see my accent? I know. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Folks, the books are, of course, for sale behind the counter. Marc will sign them for you right here. If you're watching at home online, give us a call. We'll get a book signed for you. Thank you so much for coming.